Background of the sector. This title was chosen so that we could talk about what happened in the Philippines in the last 3 years, what revolution that faced, and how they overcome them. We will use this title as overview or revisit the Japanese era against the Philippines. Japanese occupation of the Philippines occurred between 1942 and 1945, when Imperial Japan occupied the Commonwealth of the Philippines during World War II. The invasion of the Philippines started on December 8, 1941. 10 years after the attack of Pearl Harbor, American aircraft were severely damaged in the initial Japanese attack. Lacking aircraft and the American assistic field in the Philippines withdrew to the Java on December 12, 1942. General Douglas MacArthur was ordered out, leaving his men at Corregidor on the night March 12, 1942 from Australia. The 76,000 starving and sick American and the Filipinos defender in Bataan surrendered in April 9, 1942, and were forced to endorse the infamous Bataan Death March, on which 7,000 to 10,000 dead or were murdered. The 13,000 survivors or on Corregidor surrendered on May 6. Japan occupied Philippines for over 3 years until the surrender of Japan. A highly effective guerrilla campaign by Philippines Resistance Force controls 60% of the island, most jungle and mountain areas. MacArthur supplied them by submarine and sent reinforcement and officers. The invasion of the Philippines had 4 objectives: to prevent the use of the Philippines as the advanced base of the operation by American force, to acquire staging areas and supply base enhanced operation against the Dutch, East Indies, and Guam, to secure the lines of the communication between occupied area in the south and the Japanese home islands, to limit the allied intervention when they attempt to launch an offensive campaign in the Australia and the Solomon Islands via dispatching all the force stationed in the country and other neighborhood nation.
Japan's Parma surrendered on September 2, 1945. The surrender of Imperial Japan was announced by Japanese Emperor Hirohito on August 15 and formally signed on September 2, 1945. But before the Japanese surrender, the Philippines had suffered a great loss of life and tremendous physical destruction by the time that war was over. An estimated 527,000 Filipinos, both military and civilian, had been killed from all causes. Of this, between 131,000 and 164,000 were killed in 72 war crime events. According to what I read about the way life of the Filipinos during the Japanese period, I learned a lot how the Filipinos risked their lives at the hands of the Japanese. And 3 years of Japanese control over us, the Philippines suffered loss of lives and Filipinos continue to be slaves by the Japanese soldier. For them, it's very embracing experience, especially when it's done in the front of their countrymen. They will provide severe punishment for petty crimes. Other crimes by the Japanese include bombing, killing innocent people, burning houses, killing children, beheading people they think are guerrilla but are innocent, vulnerable women were raped, and many more. It shows different beliefs and practice during the time. Most of them were concerned with the atrocities committed against the Filipino people. These events of suffering were being paid for the Japanese government until today. How things changed during the Japanese rules over the Philippines. A strict curfew was enforced. The Japanese currency was introduced. Barangay neighborhood government system were cut in half. A military government was implemented as it was during a time of war. Japanese education policies were embodied in Military Order No. 2 in 1942. The Philippine Executive Commission established the Commission of Education, Health, and Public Welfare in Schools were reopened in June 1942. On October 14, 1943, the Japanese-sponsored republic created the Ministry of Education. Under the Japanese regime, the teaching of Tagalog, Philippines history, and character education was reserved for Filipinos. Love for works and dignity of labor was emphasized. On February 27, 1945, the Department of Instruction was made part of the Department of Public Instruction.
During the past several years, this panel has met and reviewed the research plan of our group that we are the research must do and planned for the Japanese era. That no one can be influence our country, and as Filipino we will save each person for the sake of the Philippines. We should protect our own country, and we have the same mindset for each person that can be influenced by the person who made the World War. As for now, we plan for these scenes that we can be expand the military and civil for the good sake of each person who must be in the duties. The military are willing to be duties 24/7 in the station that will be help the person in every area in the Philippines, and we can be used for our safety and can easily abused by the Japanese.
After reading our research, which is the Filipino lifestyle during Japanese colonization, I gained the knowledge of the Japanese period, which lasted from 1941 to 1945, was one of the darkest period in the Philippine history. The invasion of Ireland began on December 8, 1941 and on December 24, 1941. Japanese forces were able to land and march toward the Philippines northern region. Many vital necessities as well as diseases such as malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis began to rise as a result of Japanese occupation. I realized that the life of Filipinos was difficult during the Japanese era because they were occupied by the Japanese and there was still World War II. So we were lucky and we did experience it.